Hello, everyone. You can say that back if you want to. Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Carrie Priest. I'm an associate professor here in the Staley School of Leadership Studies, and I'm pleased to serve as the chair of What Matters to Me and Why lecture series. And so to those of you in the room and to our colleagues who are joining us by Zoom, welcome. Hope you enjoy your lunch, and we're so excited that you're here. So our series is sponsored this fall by the Staley School of Leadership Studies and supported by a cross-campus planning committee whose names appear here on the screen. So you can wave or stand, and let's just thank our committee and our sponsors. There's a book I really love by the author Peter Block on community and belonging, and I was rereading it recently, and it came across this quote. Sorry, it's a little bit long, but I put it up here on the screen that I thought was really appropriate as we think about today. It says, "The key to creating or transforming community is to see the power in the small but important elements of being with others. The shift we seek needs to be embodied in each invitation we make, each relationship we encounter, and each meeting we attend. For at the most operational and practical level, after all the thinking about policy, strategy, mission, and milestones, it gets down to this: how are we going to be when we are together?" This speaker series is an invitation to come and be with others. We attend many meetings for many reasons. Important reasons, as we teach and we study and work and lead in our divisions, departments, programs, and offices. Equally important is the opportunity to meet here, to hold space for relationships and reflection on what matters most to our campus and community colleagues. Affirming and celebrating our many perspectives and journeys is how we embrace and enact our shared values and principles of community. We're very lucky today, as here to introduce our speaker is someone who knows him very well, Miss Sally Kastner, who can come on down. The youngest of two Kastner children, Sally is a fifth grader at Amanda Arnold Elementary School. She has several loves and is involved in leadership. Here's a little more about Sally. She loves books, gymnastics, cup stacking, basset hounds, and laughing with friends, and she is a servant leader in her school and has served as a student ambassador, and just a month ago was elected to serve on Amanda Arnold Student Council. So let's congratulate her on that. Please welcome Sally, who will introduce her dad.
Thank you. My brother Ian would be here if it wasn't for a perfect attendance drawing for a car that they have at the high school at the end of the school year. I hope he wins. I've known Dr. Kastner, or as I like to call him, Professor Snacks, a lot, all my life, mostly because, well, he's my dad. Dad loves history, learning, and teaching, and that is what he's going to talk about today. Here's a little history on him. He was born in Pullman, Washington, and moved to Manhattan, Kansas when he was a baby. He grew up in Manhattan, where he went to Lee Elementary and Amanda Arnold Elementary, the school I go to now. After surviving middle school and graduating from high school in Manhattan, he went to Kansas State University, where he continued with his love of learning and history, but more importantly, he met my mom, Suzy. They both graduated from K-State and got married in 1998 here in Manhattan. Dad really likes school. After that, he studied at the London South Bank University in England, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and finally the University of Guelph in Canada. He also is an Anglican priest. My dad works at K-State's vet school and has been working and teaching at K-State since 2003. He uses history when he teaches and preaches. I appreciate his sense of humor, and in many ways he shows love for me. Eating my Halloween candy is not one of them. He's a notorious snacker, but he gets that from his dad, Papa Kurt, the king of all snackers. He worked at K-State too, so please raise the roof and hide your food for my dad, Justin Kastner.
Hide your food. Oh, man. Well, very warm welcome to all of you. And my thanks to Dr. Carrie Priest, Dr. Trish Gott, Andrea Luke, Mark Hansard, Dean Tim DeNoble, and some of the others that I conferred with as I prepared my remarks for today. It's an honor to be here. Last month, Dr. B. Stoney spoke, and if you were here, you'll recall that she talked quite a bit about where she came from, the importance of family life in her history. And so I'm going to do something similar to Dr. Stoney, and I'm going to share a fair amount about family. This is a picture of Suzy, my wife, and my grandmother. My grandmother on my dad's side, and we called her Mama Darlene. One of the advantages of getting married to Suzy is that Suzy has a lot more street smarts than me, and so she would educate me on sort of important practical details of life, one of which was the true reality about my grandmother's hair. In this picture, Mama Darlene's in her 80s, and I remember telling Suzy shortly after we were married, I thought it was so amazing how her hair was still red. And Suzy quickly educated me. Now, 21 years later, my mother-in-law is telling me that I need to do something to my hair. But anyways, in this picture, you can see Suzy and Mama Darlene sharing something. I think it's a scarf. Giving gifts is one of the so-called love languages, gift giving. Counselors, pastors, psychologists have analyzed this phenomenon of love languages. And in addition to gift giving, there's also physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, maybe Sally snacking. Maybe that's my love language. What do you think? But I want to share how Mama Darlene and I, one night on 2 different continents, through a phone call, had some pretty special quality time. So this is Mama Darlene again with my grandfather, Carly. Don't ask me why we called my grandfather Carly, but we called him by his first name. And of course, this picture is taken, looks like in the 50s. But in the fall of 1998, Suzy and I were newly married. We were living overseas in London. Suzy either was working or had gone to bed before me or something, but there was a late night lecture in the postgraduate student housing complex where we lived. And it was a lecture about Charles Lindbergh. If you know anything about Charles Lindbergh, you know that Charles Lindbergh was the first to fly an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean. And I went to this lecture, and at the time, I was interested in things like politics, to some degree math, certainly science. Wasn't too keen on history, but I just really was captivated by this talk. It was about Charles Lindbergh, how he flew across the Atlantic in May 1927. And then there was this whole segment in the talk, this lecture, talking about the drama and the alarm and anxiety that was going on in America when Charles Lindbergh and Anne Murrow's son was kidnapped. Anyways, it was just a part of American history that I'd never really studied. I was interested in it suddenly. And I went back to our flat, and for some reason I called Mama Darlene. And we talked for probably an hour and a half. You can imagine talking to your grandma for an hour and a half, and it was entirely academic. It was all about Charles Lindbergh. It was about how when she was a little bit older than Sally, remembered the flyers and the circulars being distributed across her hometown, announcing this amazing feat in 1927. And then she knew tons about the supposed kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's and Anne Murrow's son in 1932. Mama Darlene was born in 1915, so she would have been a teenager when that happened. And so she really had a lot to say, had experienced this, and something happened that night. Something happened to me and Mom and Darlene, we had a quality time, and it was all about history, you know, a seemingly esoteric, seemingly, you know, almost trivial matter. But we formed a connection. And, you know, I think that that taught me that history just maybe matters to me. And in many ways, since fall of 1998, I have just fallen more and more and more in love with history. I'm teaching a class this fall called Human and Veterinary Public Health in the Age of Sherlock Holmes. And the author of the Sherlock Holmes canon, Arthur Conan Doyle, clearly someone who was interested in writing, clearly someone who had an understanding of history. He did not actually become interested in history until a family member sent him a book. And although I would never compare myself to Arthur Conan Doyle, I can identify with that. You know, it didn't really occur to me how much I really loved history until I had that moment, that telephone call across the Atlantic with Mom and Darlene in the fall of '98. But, you know, the essence of that connection with Mom and Darlene wasn't just historical, it was also about her. It was about her history. It was about my connection to her as my grandmother. And, you know, last month, there was another What Matters to Me and Why theme talk delivered in this room. Max Spinberg, who's a phenom anti-hunger activist and thought leader, he spoke at the Spirit of Leadership event that was held here. And he kind of rephrased this theme for our lecture series. And he said it wasn't so much what mattered to him, but who mattered to him. And I think that this idea of who matters to you can help you discover the real value of what matters to you. And I would say that for me, as I'll share today, history has been kind of the on-ramp to deeper relationships and a more full nurturing of those relationships. By the way, many, many thanks to the director of the Staley School of Leadership Studies, Dr. Gott. Where's Trish? In the back. Yeah, Trish. Thank you for superintending this. There she is behind the screen. Her food is safe. It's on the other side of the screen, Sally. And Dr. Priest, because of that event, which was held on October the 4th, Max and I were able to connect, as I oftentimes do, at the food table after his lecture. And I mentioned as an aside that I was going to be in Washington, D.C. in 2 weeks' time. And he quickly invited me, the folks that we were going to be training from St. Lucia, and some other K-State students along on the trip. And so literally 2 weeks after a What Matters to Me and Why lecture, we were in his home. He was making us dinner, hosting us dinner. So the Staley School, good on you for fostering friendship. As Dr. Priest was saying, that's what this is all about. It's about fostering community, and it's happening. So many, many thanks. So who matters to me? Of course, my family. This is Suzy, Ian, and Sally. But Suzy is the core of our family. And oftentimes when we're introduced, they will say, this is Suzy and Justin, this is Suzy, the fun one. And then they'll look at me with a blank stare. But Suzy really is adventurous. She's highly intelligent. She's very relationally wise. You know, when I get high-level dating questions from our son, or when Suzy is being approached by younger students asking for advice, they can look to Suzy as a giver of pearls of wisdom relationally. She has a lot of insight, a lot of wisdom, and of course that spills over into our family life. But Suzy is just so much fun, and you know, I consider myself to be a relatively extroverted person, but Suzy really is. And if those of you here who know her know that to be true. Here's one of my favorite moments with Suzy. So we lived in London in the first year of our marriage. Every 10 years, the Queen Elizabeth, would come and pay a visit to the postgraduate student housing complex where we lived. And I was a student. Suzy was working for an educational advisory service just down the street from where we lived. And because the Queen came the year we were there, Suzy dragged all of her British coworkers to come see the Queen. And it was extraordinary. And the rules of engagement were pretty simple. You do not touch the Queen. She's the anointed one. You do not talk to her. She can initiate a conversation with you. You just politely watch and see if she engages with you. So here's Suzy with her English friends and coworkers, and Her Majesty's walking by, and she stops. And who does she talk to? Not one of her legitimate subjects, but Suzy. And it was about a 30-second long conversation. And, you know, just like me, Suzy, in that fall of 1998, became more and more interested in history. And of course, that included, you can't live in London and not become fascinated with the history of kings and queens. So here's the one take home. You all get to go home today with one useless trivia, or perhaps useful trivia point of knowledge. And that is how to remember the fates of all of King Henry VIII's wives, okay? This is really helpful. It's an English school children mnemonic, okay? And maybe I'll just let Suzy do it. What is it?
Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived.
There you go. So, anyways, I've got to believe that'll come in handy like on a late night Trivial Pursuit, you know, maybe New Year's Eve. If nothing else, you've just learned something. So divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Now, when Suzy and I had children, and we had this affection for history, we had to make a decision. How were we going to orientate our children into history? So you'll be relieved to know that we don't take them to museums and make them stare at hieroglyphs, right? Look at their faces, right? No, Ian's and Sally's introduction to history hasn't been so much through museums, although Sally may be saying, that's not entirely true, Dad. But it's been through their own personal interests. It's been through connecting what they're learning in school with maybe a trip or some travel that we're doing. So for example, here's Sally. Sally on the left here wearing Suzy's middle school t-shirt. You know, there's so much that can be learned and fostered in historical appreciation just within our own families. In this case, a simple t-shirt. Last May, we went to Yosemite National Park, and some of those trees, including this one that Sally's in front of, you know, date back to Antony and Cleopatra. It's extraordinary. Trees that have been around that long. And it's awe-inspiring, it's mesmerizing to think about just the size and scope of history. But, you know, Sally has many loves, narwhals amongst them, but also gymnastics. Last year and the year before, Sally was able to compete in a gymnastics competition in the historic Union Station in Kansas City. You know, being there, being in the environment, seeing this historic building, that just maybe sparks an interest in history. But gymnastics really has become something that Sally is really keen on. So it's cool, in February, we're gonna go to, or Sally's gonna go, and we're gonna tag along to a gymnastics meet in Oklahoma that is put on by Nadia Comaneci and Bart Connor. And those of you who are my age or older will understand who those two people are. Interestingly, Nadia Comaneci and Bart Connor, who are married, who run this meet, and they run a clinic together in Oklahoma, they met in March 1976 in this space. Anyone know this space? Someone said it? Madison Square Garden. And what city is Madison Square Garden in? New York City. Now, Sally mentioned our son Ian. You know, Ian is, he's in love with New York City. And so last March, I had a research trip to the Brooklyn Public Library. I took Ian with me. And Ian skateboarded, he did cool things. He actually had to sit with me by the microfiche machine in the Brooklyn Public Library. Is that cruel and unusual punishment or what? You're gonna love history. It's like, when can we leave, Dad? But it was cool, you know, we went on the subway once, we came up out of the subway and boom, what did we see? Federal Hall. This was something that Ian had just taken a test on the week before in his US history class. And it's making those connections with our children that has really helped nurture, to some degree, history. And indeed, as Sally mentioned, Ian's in the drawing for something other than a minivan by not being here today. Of course, my parents matter to me, and my brother. And I want to just chat a little bit about an experience that happened, my brother, my mom, and I, this last May when we were at Yosemite. If you've ever been there, or if you've ever been to a place that doesn't have light pollution, it's extraordinary how you can see the stars. And we were at this place called Glacier Point, up high, situated up high, no light pollution. And in my mom's own words, it was like you could touch the stars. And I would say, if you are interested in trying out history, giving it a go, seeing if maybe it matters to you, like it matters to me, go out into rural Kansas and look at the stars. Quite literally, you were looking back in time. You were looking back in history. And for me, even when I was younger than Sally, it was a fascination with the night sky, with astronomy, that really fostered this, this love for things past and things eternal. Well, there's others who matter to me, and I have to recognize those that have been my principal mentors in history. On the left, on the very far left of the dining table, is someone by the name of Ashley Knoll. Ashley was the chaplain, the Anglican priest in the postgraduate student housing complex where Suzy and I lived our first year of marriage. He has been, more than anyone, a mentor to me. He is the one who tutored me when I went through my ordination exam preparation, become ordained. He is probably the #1 expert on the ecclesiastical, that is church history of the English Reformation. And he is really good at Trivial Pursuit. On the right is my PhD advisor, Dr. Doug Powell. He now lives in Australia. I studied under him in Canada. Here he is holding a meat thermometer. There's a few of my food safety colleagues in the room who understand Doug's passion for food safety. But I credit Doug for...
¿Están adentro?
Yeah. So I credit Doug for...
Vengo del... Los uso cuando estoy en X, mainly.
What should we do, Carrie? Last night, Sally was practicing with Spanish. It's your chance. Very good. So Doug on the right in the Seahawks jersey, he was the one who said to me, Justin, if you really have a fascination with the history of science, if you really have an interest in international trade from a historical standpoint, you can study that under my direction. And so I was able to spend 3 years in Canada studying under Doug, being able to really feed my intellectual curiosity regarding the history of trade, the history of veterinary public health, and related domains. Well, to get a bit more academic, if you will, I want to unpack what history kind of means theoretically and experientially. And we're going to go to a place close to where I studied in Canada, to Niagara Falls. Who's been to Niagara Falls? Very good. So this is a great illustration. So you're familiar with this, many of you. Up from Niagara Falls, right here, is an iron scow, an old boat that is sitting there in the water above the Horseshoe Falls. And by the way, if you've been to Niagara Falls, you know that the best way to view the Niagara Falls is from the Canadian side, because you can see the whole contour of the falls. And this iron scow, this boat, has been lodged in the Niagara River for 100 years, okay? But it moved. It moved just a couple of weeks ago on Halloween night. It's interesting. The history of the iron scow is that in August 1918, there was a tugboat pulling this other boat, the scow, and the chain rope snapped, and the scow got stuck, and they ended up having to rescue the 2 sailors, actually. That happened in August 1918. The scow was stuck, and it stayed there for 101 years until just a few weeks ago. And I'm going to play this video that kind of talks a little bit about the history of this. Looking for the mouse. Great.
We're here at Toronto Power Park, and behind me is the remains of the scow. This is a dumping scow that was lodged here in August of 1918, and it has been in place for over 101 years, but it appears that last night on Halloween that the scow shifted. So for many years, Canadians had a great view of the scow. It's been deteriorating badly, and we have aerial footage from last year when we wanted to mark the centennial of the rescue that took place on August 7th, 1918. And it really shows that there wasn't a lot of the scow left, and it was important for us to record what the scow looked like. And we're here again today to record what's happened to the scow overnight. Now, will it stay in place? Well, it's been stuck there for 101 years. It appears to have sort of flipped on its side and spun around. It's not in the exact same spot it was yesterday. We think it's about 50 meters downriver from its original location. And what we think has happened now is it's turned and twisted in the very heavy current and flow of the river and is stuck where it is now. And it could be stuck there for days, or it could be stuck there for years. It's anyone's guess.
Is it somehow possible that the scow's past is still very much active and overlapping with the present? Now my dean is here and she's nodding. That's deep, Justin. Yeah. Think about that. Is the past merely a prelude to the present? Or is the past, in the language of Edwin Friedman, something that resides within the present? Maybe eat a cookie or drink some water and chew on that. I believe that the past very much resides in the present. It explains why we have such common experiences despite the economic, the technological, the social and political changes that happen over the course of time, why many of the same issues still prevail, why those love languages that I mentioned earlier, they had currency in centuries past. Yes, time is marching on, but it's not like past is sort of shut off from the present. This is true in shallow, mundane, superficial aspects of life. I'm a New York Giants fan, and when I cheer for the Giants, I am cheering, yes, for, although reluctantly, Daniel Jones, the new quarterback that recently replaced Eli Manning. But you know, even Daniel Jones here in the upper right-hand corner picture, he wore Eli Manning's jersey when he was a kid. Isn't that funny? You know, and when I was Sally's age, I loved the Giants. That's how I became a fan, was in when I was at Amanda Arnold. Chiefs weren't doing so well then, Jonathan. And players like Lawrence Taylor, Mark Bavaro, Phil Simms really captivated my imagination about the Giants. So when I'm cheering for the Giants, even if they're having a lousy season, and I think they are, it's not so much that I'm just occupying this present 2019 season. I'm actually drawing on memories and real events that happened in the past. The past is very much part of the present. Well, that's kind of a shallow example. Let's talk about something a bit more sophisticated, shall we, Sally? So Sally mentioned that she's at Amanda Arnold Elementary. When Amanda Arnold opened in 1985, there was this really important political moment, this really important critical decision in the history of elementary schools in Manhattan, Kansas. And it was the vote on what would be the new mascot for this new school. And there were two factions. There were the Eagles, those that wanted the Eagles, and those that wanted the Pandas, okay? And I voted for the Eagles, as did a lot of my friends. And although Rudy Giuliani wasn't present, I know that a scandalous thing happened. I know that someone rigged this election. I have it on testimony from a neighbor who will remain anonymous. They have to be subpoenaed to come clean. But it sounds silly, but I very much remember this vote and how I wanted the mascot to be the Eagles. But of course, there's marketing cachet and real value in being able to say you're the Amanda Pandas. Kind of has a ring to it, right? So anyways, I talk about this ad nauseum. Sally rolls her eyes, her friends roll their eyes. But just this year, Sally and some of her classmates, they wrote an essay, kind of studied the history of this mascot controversy scandal. And they even came up with some pretty innovative ideas about how the wrongs of history could be righted. And you can maybe ask Sally about that sometime. Now, does it really matter, Sally, that the mascot vote was rigged? No, it doesn't matter nearly as much as the quality of life, the quality of connection that Sally and I have been able to have by talking about a seemingly trivial matter. We've had lots of jokes, we've laughed about it, we've had more to talk about regarding this mascot controversy. And the point, I would say, of so much of the academic learning, I certainly love to learn historical things, the value of dialoguing about the past is not just that, right? It's about deepening the connections, deepening the relationships that we have. And that certainly is the case with me and Sally. When I was Sally's age, I had a Halley's Comet, or a Halley's Comet, correct pronunciation, a Halley's Comet birthday party. I mentioned I liked astronomy as a kid. And I invited my friends over, my parents, long-suffering parents, got us up at 2 a.m. We went to Warner Park, got out our telescopes and looked at Halley's Comet in 1986. Halley's Comet comes around how many years every year? 70? Jim, you probably know this.
Like 2000.
Good guess. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Hohenberry, 76.1 years. So the next time Halley's Comet comes around in 2061, Sally will be in her 50s, right? And the clockwork, both in the past and in the future of Halley's Comet, is absolutely amazing. 12 times ago that Halley's Comet was visiting Earth, there was something going on in England called the Battle of Hastings. England had made a judgment call to put someone by the name of Harold on the throne. There was a contested controversy over who really deserved to be the king of England. One of those people that thought he should be king was a dude by the name of William of Normandy, William the Conqueror. You maybe have heard of him. And in 1066, he invaded England. Well, there is a propaganda tapestry. It's about 2/3 of a football field long in Bayeux, France. It was sewn by weavers in Kent, England, in around 1080. And it really was celebrating this victory by the Normans over Harold and his fellow Englishmen. What's interesting is in that tapestry, there is a picture depicted here of a star. What is that star? That is Halley's Comet. And Halley's Comet in early 1066 was seen to be a bad omen. And Harold, who ended up being dethroned, was warned and said, this is a bad sign for your political career. Who knows? But it's fascinating. So Halley's Comet comes around every 76.1 years. I find that fascinating. In my teaching and research at the veterinary college, I draw on a lot of trade disputes that I've spent most of my library time studying, and those are trade disputes over animal disease and food safety. Many of them occurred in the late 19th century. One of those is related to a lung disease in cattle that really caused major disruption in the transatlantic livestock trade, and there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from those past 19th century disputes for today. One of the characters that I studied for about 2.5 years as a veterinarian died in 1900. His name was William Williams. Professor Williams was a veterinary professor, and he was unusual in that he disagreed with the diagnosis of a particular animal disease, contagious bovine pleuropneumonia. He took a stand and to his death argued that the American cattle did not have this disease. And during that time, you could forgive both sides for not knowing exactly, because this was before they properly understood the causative organism. But I spent 2.5 years studying this guy, delving into historical documents, historical accounts of him, William Williams. Fast forward, remember, the past resides in the present. Fast forward, his great-granddaughter, Jacqueline. Through some circumstances, Suzy and I were able to connect with her, become friends with her. She sends Christmas cards to the kids and books to the kids. She lives in London. And then just a summer and a half ago, or 2 summers ago, Jacqueline and Ian and Sally and Suzy and I went and saw Wicked in London with the great-granddaughter of this veterinarian that I spent 2.5 years studying. Really has enriched the love of learning for the history of veterinary public health for me. I'm going to play this video. This is a student, recent graduate from K-State, talking about the role of history in her learning.
I moved here from Alaska, and Mycoplasma pneumoniae has recently infiltrated Alaska. I also have a very strong interest in ruminants, specifically cattle. So I looked into different mycoplasmas that affect cattle, such as Mycoplasma mycoides and Mycoplasma bovis. I think it's very important to have kind of a foundation or a background, at least know what's going on in history, to kind of pave the way for what can happen in the future of science, to know where we've come from and where we can go. So in Dr. Kastner's trade courses, it's pretty common to delve into the history of trade, and you'll read about that in the Food and Agricultural Security course textbook. So in those courses, it's not uncommon to go into different historical topics of livestock trade in the 19th century. In the courses, you'll read quite a bit in the Food and Agricultural Security textbook about trichinosis and the pork trade in the 19th century, as well as contagious bovine pleuropneumonia and Mycoplasma mycoides in that same time period. You can learn about how veterinarians worked with physicians and worked with public health officials to solve problems and investigate things. And a lot of vet med is problem solving. So you can learn about how they used to problem solve when a lot of the sciences were in their infancy and how they have advanced.
John Quincy Adams says that if your actions inspire others to learn more, then you are a leader. And I have, humanly speaking, tried my best to leverage the fascination that I have with history to get my students, DVM students, Masters in Public Health students, food science students, undergraduate honors students, to want to learn more. And as we have the great patriarch of the history of veterinary medicine here, Howard Erickson, you've done that, Howard. And isn't it easy to use history to foster a love of learning? It's extraordinary. And in whatever field you're in, using history to light fire in the hearts and minds of students is a great way to go. And I have received so much, I've been able to have so much to talk about with my students through the lens of history that has motivated them to learn more. Now, it's not all through courses though. So I have spent much of my career in library archives, falling more in love with history. So what do? I subject my students to going to archives. One of the favorite ones that I have is in Kansas City at the University of Kansas School of Medicine. Don McInnes, who's the rare books librarian there, just a couple weeks ago, hosted a group of students learning about the history of public health, history of medicine, and Arthur Conan Doyle. There's also a treasure trove of materials there at the School of Medicine that can just maybe for one student, not every student's life is changed by these trips, but just maybe one student ends up falling more in love with learning through history. In the past, we've been able to take students to Washington, D.C. and Virginia, to archives like Gunston Hall, where George Mason was based, his plantation, but also to restaurants where there are historical reenactments of some of the supposed contemporaries of George Washington. Here's a picture of one of them at a restaurant called Gatsby's Tavern. The point of all this is that although I get jazzed by history, my role as an educator is to somehow, just maybe, share that love with my students so that they're more interested in continuing to grow in their field, in their love of their field. So, history matters to me. What I would like to conclude with is just to say that, yes, history matters to me, but, you know, several years ago, Sally's brother Ian, when he was very young, he was sitting at the table and he was eating chocolate. You picture a child eating chocolate? And he says something very profound to me. He says, "Dad, did you know that when I eat chocolate, my toes wiggle?" Now, it would be absurd for Ian to seek the wiggling of his toes, right? The wiggling of his toes is connected to something, to go back to our Niagara Falls picture, something upstream. It's the chocolate, right? And for me, history matters to me, but what really is the thing that I seek is what's upstream. Because it turns out that not all of history is good. There are past regrets. There are unprecedented futures. And as someone, as a person who has talked today a lot about the good of history, let's not forget that history itself is not existing just in a vacuum. I'm an Anglican priest, but I value perspectives in all different parts of the church. One of the most influential Roman Catholic theologians of the 20th century made a brilliant statement about how we ought to understand history in light of our Christian faith. I'd just like to share a little bit about his perspective. If you are familiar with the Christian faith, you know that it is all about faith in a person who claimed to be God, Jesus, God incarnate. The whole apparatus of Christmas is all about celebrating the incarnation, the fancy theological word for God emptying himself into a person. But it wasn't just an emptying into a person, it was also emptying an eternally present God into a historical moment. 2,000 years ago. And this theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, he makes an observation that although Jesus was God, Jesus did not, in his humanity, have the ability to anticipate all of the next steps in his life. Think about that. To go from being eternally conscious of everything to being locked in, so to speak, to history and not knowing what comes next. Anyone experience that in their life, not knowing what is coming next? One of the reasons why I love history, but even more than that, love Jesus, is that he understands what it's like to be locked into history. Today is November 14th, 2019. I don't know why I remember these things. It's just an eccentric characteristic, but I remember where I was on November 14th, 1996. Those of you who've been around Manhattan a while, you may be familiar with the fact that I served on the Manhattan City Commission. This was back when I had no interest in history and only interest in politics. On November 14th, 1996, I had to go down to the Manhattan Mercury and tell them that I was not going to run again. And of course, the whole city sighed in relief. But I remember very distinctly what it was like. I was over by the Beach Museum. I was parking my 1971 Chevy Nova. It's an awesome car. And I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do next? So I walked under that archway at the beach. You know that archway? You can see the leaves. You can picture November day. Actually, just picture today. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know what's next. This is before I had started dating Suzy. This is before I went to graduate school. This is before I really had any sense of vision or purpose for the future. I was, you might say, anxious about the future. But you know, if the past resides in the present, then those feelings that I had in November of 1996 somehow still impact me today. But the good news is this, is that I know 23 years later that there was reason to have hope for a future. And much like Jesus, it is possible to step forward into those unprecedented future moments. And that is ultimately why history matters to me, because I can look back and see God's faithfulness and maybe just continue to press on bit by bit into each and every unprecedented moment in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take some questions or comments from the audience, and we'll ask that you do use the microphone for the benefit of our colleagues on Zoom.
Thank you for bringing up, Kimathi Choma, I'm on the committee. Thank you for bringing up that there are past pains in history. How do we look at history in conversing with our children about those past pains and then bring them into the present as we live as a result of what has happened in the past? Like you said, the past is present today, and there's difficult conversations that need to be had around the past pains of history.
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Kimathi. I think ultimately we have to appeal to some greater force other than the accumulation of bad habits, the accumulation of destructive decisions, the accumulation of wars, the accumulation of slavery. We have to, otherwise we all despair into, actually what we can do is we can despair into the sense of fate. Life sucks, there's no reason to have hope. We could see life almost like Halley's Comet. Oh, here it comes again. Another recession. Oh, here it comes again. Another war. Oh, here. But, you know, for me, I believe that there is not to put it in too strongly religious terms, there's a Lord of history who is greater than that, who can redeem even the bad stuff. You know, there's an obscure word of prophecy in the Old Testament, in the book of Joel, about how God can restore the years the locusts have eaten. This idea that even though things seem lost, somehow, amazingly, not all is lost. And even the past wounds, God can be a good steward of. So that's a vague and quasi-theological answer, but thank you, Kamathi.
Thank
you. My name's Jim. I'm an astronomer. My question is, when I talk to members of my family about political issues, they tend to think that history supports their point of view.
Yeah.
I tend to think that it supports my point of view.
Yeah.
How do you sort the relationship between history and the use of history for ideological purposes?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Well, there's the pithy but accurate saying that the winners write history, the winners of wars, right? And that sounds cheesy, but it's actually, in many cases, true. You know, the craft I try to teach my students when it comes to, say, the history of science is to use footnotes to acknowledge different perspectives. Because at the end of the day, the craft of historical scholarship is actually making judgment calls. But the good news is that even when we disagree about how to interpret the past, we can enter into a dialogue, into a discussion. I mean, silly, but Sally and I, we have, shall we say, a difference of opinion about the Amanda Arnold mascot, right? But true to the spirit of the Staley School and the What Matters to Me and Why lecture series, whether it's historical scholarship or a discussion about something in the past, the point isn't so much always winning every single point of argument, but enriching our connection with one another. So, and I know the Hohenberries are like an exemplary Manhattan family, so I'm sure that you are enriching your family life every time Jim goes to the mat arguing something.
I'm Tani Martinez, and I'm also on the committee, and we're so grateful for your time. As in the context of public health, what is your number one concern?
Well, I will stick to the area that I know the most about, because there's so many issues in public health. Outside of what I'm, quote unquote, have some expertise in, I would say the mental health issue is the biggest one for me. But within my domain of supposed expertise, I would say it is the reemergence of diseases that our clinicians maybe don't routinely recognize, and how devastating that could be economically for trade, but also for health. So I think having a watchful eye and being on the front foot to realize that, it is true that there could be an unprecedented reemergence of a disease, and we need to be on the front foot to catch that.
Hi, I'm Patty McKenna, and I'm a Master of Public Health student. I've been thinking a lot about I went to that Living in the Human Age talk the other day at McCain, and he mentioned that in 1900 there was 1.6 billion humans, and in 2000 there was 6.1 billion humans. And we're using an awful lot of resources, just even beyond that, particularly in, America. And so I'm wondering how to envision a sustainable future. And thinking about that envisioning process. If you don't have a vision of how things could be in the future, you can't really get there very well. And so I guess I'm wondering, how could history be used to help us to envision a future where it's okay for as many people as possible in the world?
Yeah, I think courage, especially amongst the politically elite, will be essential to the way forward. And how can we benefit from history for them? I think we look to, for instance, John F. Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage. One of my favorite chapters in that book is about Lucius Cincinnatus Lamar, who was a senator, I think, from Mississippi. And he talks about, or John F. Kennedy tells a story about how this senator, basically commits political suicide by taking the right economically wise position, in this case on what kind of a currency the U.S. should have and whether or not we should have free coinage of silver. And it was very unpopular, the position he took. But in a speech in Congress, he said, he didn't say it this way, he said, I know you all think I'm wrong, but guess what? I am sitting at the top of the mast of the ship, and I see the destruction that we're headed for if we go with free coinage of silver. So, but he ends up, guess what? He loses, gets removed by the Mississippi legislature, because back then we didn't elect senators directly. They were chosen by the legislature. The Mississippi legislature recalls him. That was a courageous and actually self-sacrificial moment in American history. Aren't we grateful to Senator Lamar for taking that stand? Well, yeah, we are now, but in the day, no. So I think looking to the past for particularly courageous and self-sacrificing leaders will be essential to making wise decisions for the future. And anyone want to be that courageous, self-sacrificing person? Dr. Greg, you want to do that? Yeah.
Hi, Justin. So I think I attended a historical event yesterday. So I went to Wichita, had a couple of meetings, and then during my last meeting, someone says, Madai, what time are you heading back? You got to come with us. There's this thing, what's going on? And so it's the reveal of Wichita's professional baseball team, the reveal of the name and the logo, right? Oh, sure, I'll stick around. And then I get there and I hear this group of young professionals that I know that are talking about, well, we'll be able to share with our grandkids. I was here, like 70, whatever, 60, 30, whatever years later. And so is there an event that, so I started to appreciate the moment a little bit, because I was like, okay, how big of a deal is this, right? And so is there a current event or future event that you look forward to, or that you're appreciating now, that you'll be able to talk with, and then but also to that your children and your grandchildren will be able to carry and cherish?
Yeah, that's a deep question, Madai. So I like people more intelligent than me can do this more justice, but there's sort of two kinds of time that theologians talk about. There's chronos, like where we get the word watch. Time is moving on at a pace. Things are happening. But then there's kairos, moments in time, like the iron scow. Chronos, the wind and the waters moving are pushing against that boat, but then there was this moment where the boat finally moved, right? That's a kairos. And I think for things that I look forward to, I personally believe that quality time, or those kairos moments, only arise out of chronos, out of quantities of time. So we have to spend time with each other in order to sort of experience those few intermittent moments. What are those moments? Not to put it too strongly, but, Suzy and I have enjoyed watching Sally grow up. We don't sit there and watch her growing up. Is she moving? Is she eating? But, Sally coming up here and, getting her digs in on me for snacking too much. You know, that's kind of a moment. And what's that about? It's about, I feel noticed by my daughter. You know, she understands what makes me who I am. There is more to me than snacking, by the way. But I think it's those kinds of moments, Madai. You know, Suzy and I, we've been married for 21 years. When I look back, you know, there's certainly moments where we, you know, moved to a new place, or where, like, I pictured, you know, Suzy talking to the Queen, you know, those sort of memorable moments, which of course you treasure. But quality time comes only out of large quantities of time. You know, Suzy and I cannot just sit down and have quality time now. We have to spend time together and let that emerge.
And speaking of time, we are out of time. So let's thank Dr. Kastner again. Thank you. And thank you for taking time to be here and learning with us. And we hope you'll join us as we continue the series in the spring. Watch for updates on the next speaker. Thanks.